Hey, microchurch, what's up? This week we're going to continue looking at Mark chapter 7, and we're going to be in verses 14 through 23. But just kind of a reminder from last week's devotional, we looked at this idea of legalism, right? And that legalism is the idea that we have to add to our salvation to be good enough or to appear good enough, right? That we have to modify the rules, we have to change the rules so we can actually live by the rules and be righteous. But salvation, right, by grace alone, through faith alone, means that we see ourselves as Jesus truly sees us, which is loved by God. And that is enough, right? That is all we need. And so this week, though, Jesus, he kind of gets a little deeper. He gets a little more personal, and he gets a little closer, and he goes to the heart of the issue. So in starting in verse 14, chapter 7, Jesus said this: He called the people to him, and again he said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside of a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come from out of a person are what defile him." And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart but his stomach and is expelled?" Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, "What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." Right? And so Jesus, he gets to the root. He calls the people to come closer to him because he wants them to hear and he wants them to understand what he has to say. And he went on to tell them that, he goes, "Guys, listen, it's not what we put into our bodies." He just talked about washing hands and all that stuff. He goes, "It's not what we put into our bodies that makes us unclean," right? It's what comes from out of our bodies. It's what comes from out of our hearts that truly defiles us, right? Not what we take in. In other words, what Jesus is saying here is that legalism and traditionalism is an issue of our hearts, right? See, if our hearts seek after and they long for evil things, right, we're going to seek after and we're going to long for those things, right? It's that concept: if it makes you feel good, then do it, right? Which is a tragic philosophy, because our hearts are deceitful, right? But if our hearts seek after and long for Jesus and his goodness, then we're going to pursue those things instead, right? When we long for more of Jesus and we pursue the things of Jesus, right? We don't do things in order to be seen by Jesus, because we know that he already sees us and he already loves us. We do good and we do right things simply because we want to, right? We want to glorify him. We want to give him honor. We want to worship him with our lips and our hearts. And so when we talk about our heart in the scriptures, right, we aren't necessarily referring to the organ, right, the thing that pumps our blood throughout the body. When Scripture speaks about the heart of man, what it is typically referring to is the core of who a man is, the center of mankind, the core of our lives. It's our personality, right? It's who we are. And so when Jesus says that whatever is in a person's heart, whatever comes from within, that's what defiles a person. He's saying that because that's who the person is, right? And Jesus goes on to list a ton of different heart issues and heart problems that we have. He says that from the heart comes sexual immorality. And this is any kind of gross or deviant sexual behavior, right? Anything from premarital sex to extramarital sex to unnatural sexual behaviors. But when Jesus gives us life, he changes our hearts, right? He helps us to see that our sexual desires, our sexual feelings, our sexual whatever is not the basis of our identity. And he helps us to view those things as a gift and have reverence for them and respect for them and for other humans because he designed them and created them. And he helps us to see that as something that is holy and righteous and good. Theft is the next thing that he says. Taking what is not ours, right? This ranges from stealing to cheating on a test, or even cheating on our taxes. Right? When Jesus gives us life, he changes our hearts from theft to a life of generosity, a life where we want to give, right? From taking what is not ours to giving more than what we normally would want to give. The other thing that Jesus gets to is murder. Is taking the life of an innocent. Right. This includes speaking hatred. When we speak hatred to other people, man, we are killing them with our words. And so we have to make sure that even though we're not necessarily physically killing them, that we're not killing their person. They're killing their being and murdering them through the things that we say. Because those things, they cause destruction. And so when Jesus gives us life, he changes our hearts. And murder goes from taking life to giving life and building others up, right? Speaking courage into them. The next one that Jesus talks about is adultery. It's a violation of the marriage covenant, right? By looking lustfully upon another person or physically indulging in acts of passion with another person. But when Jesus gives us life, hope you're catching on to this, okay? He changes our hearts, and adultery becomes an act of self-control, an act of honoring another being, an act of honoring our spouse. It recognizes that our spouse is a gift that is given to us by God. The next one that Jesus lists is coveting. It's wanting what another person has, right? It's desiring more at the expense of another. But when Jesus gives us life, he changes our hearts. And coveting becomes contentment. It becomes rejoicing with others for what they have and what they get and what, even if we don't have it and we want it, right? The next one is wickedness. This is a plotting and a planning for evil and destruction. It's deliberately choosing the way of the dragon. But when Jesus gives us life, he changes our hearts. And he changes our hearts from planning and plotting evil to planning and plotting good for righteousness' sake. Then there's deceit, which is lying and cunning, gaining what you can at the expense of a lie, exploiting others in the process. But when Jesus gives us life, right, he changes our hearts from being deceitful to being honest and true, from hiding to transparency. Then Jesus lists sensuality. It's a life of following the impulses of addictive behavior, overeating, drunkenness, pornography, and so on, right? But when Jesus gives us life, he changes our hearts, right? He changes our hearts from impulsive behavior to self-control, and he makes us sensitive to the spiritual instead of the fleshly, right? Then envy is seeing something in another person that you don't like, right? It's hating the good that happens to them. But when Jesus gives us life, he changes our hearts from envious to celebratory, right? We start living a life of celebrating others and the good that takes place in their lives instead of resenting them for it. Then there's slander. Slander is speaking ill or wrongfully of others. It's using our words to destroy them. It's the same as hate, right? But when Jesus gives us life, he changes our hearts from slanderous to rejoicing the image of God that we see in others, from destroying others with our words to lifting them up and building them up with our words. And then pride, right? Seeing yourself as better than someone else, placing yourself above others. But when Jesus gives us life, he changes our hearts from being prideful and arrogant to being humble and loving. And the last one that Jesus mentions is foolishness. It's choosing wrong over right, right? Knowingly, over and over again. It's knowing the right thing to do, but still choosing to do the wrong thing. And when Jesus gives us life, he changes our foolish heart to a heart that pursues the way of Christ and the wisdom of God. See, all of these things are things that defile us because they're things that are rooted in our hearts, right? Things that will take us over if we let them. But when Jesus gives us life, and we trust in the life that he gives us and that he alone gives us, he changes our hearts. And from out of our hearts comes the things that can glorify and honor God, right? And he gives that to us. And so the Pharisees and the scribes, they had this gross belief of theology and sin. Right? They believed that they could measure up to the standards of the law by being good enough or doing enough good, by adding more and more and more to the law of God. But when Jesus came and lived this perfect life and he died a sinner's death, our sinner's death, he declared these words. He said, "It is finished," right? And we can live in that truth. We no longer have to live into the life that Christ has called us to live by doing and doing and doing, right? We don't earn and can never earn our righteousness. And because we can never earn it, we can stop chasing after the wind, right? And instead, we can live with the fact that Jesus already finished it. He already took care of the doing by his dying on the cross. He changed the verbiage from doing to done, right? And because of this, we can stop adding to the law of the Lord, and we can start living into the completed work of the cross, because if we follow Jesus, he already declared us as enough.